It may be August and more than a year before the 2012 elections, but time is starting to run out for redistricting reform advocates. The state commission that is charged with redrawing the lines, which is known as LAT4, has already begun its work, and now there is some speculation that LAT4 may not release maps until January. That would leave very little time to make changes prior to the primary elections, and today the New York Times editorial board called for Governor Cuomo to get more involved in the process. That is something my next guest would also like to see. He is Dick Dadey, and he is the executive director of Citizens Union. He's joining us from New York City tonight. Dick, it is good to see you again.
Always good to see you, Liz.
All right,
Thank
so
you.
This is a little curious. This is the line from the Times. The word on the street, which I don't know what that means, is that LAT4 may stall the release of the new maps for the 2012 election and the decade to follow until early next year, and then say basically it's too late, sorry, you got to go with our plan. First of all, are you hearing that word on the street too?
Well, if LAT4 is allowed to continue this process, I would not be surprised if that's the way it unfolded, because it would be to the legislature's benefit to wait until the last possible minute to release those lines, because then when the governor vetoes those lines, there's very little time for the courts to intervene. And with very little time, the courts then would have a great deal of deference to the legislative drawn maps, and would not be able to tinker as much as they would like, I think. Okay.
I've talked to Assemblyman Jack McEnany. He's been in here a couple of times, and we've talked about redistricting, and I haven't gotten the feeling from him that they are stalling. I mean, is it the Democrats that's the problem? Is it the Republicans that's the problem? I know that there's a lawsuit. We've talked about it, the prison gerrymandering suit. I mean, are you hearing any chatter behind the scenes?
Well, the chatter I hear is really going on about trying to bring the legislature back in special session to create a more impartial process than the current process.
Is that real?
There are discussions.
There are discussions, really?
Yes, there are discussions, and you know, I know that the governor has made very clear, as we know even last month when he publicly stated that he would veto lines if they are drawn and presented to him by LAT4. And I know that that has been communicated, you know, privately as well, and the legislative leaders are well aware of it. And I think that's why you might see them, you know, holding off until the very end, so that they have more control of the process. I mean, giving the courts as little time as possible to change these lines is to the legislature's advantage. The Speaker of the Assembly doesn't really care all that much if the courts have to come in and change the lines a little bit after the governor vetoes it. But the Republican Senate would have to, because a tuck here and a tweak here could really affect the balance of power.
So when you say that these conversations are going on, that we might see the legislature, we're going to see the legislature come back at some point, although, you know, the Senate Republicans are really not sounding like they think that there's any necessity, with the exception of the PEF contract, right? And we won't know about that until September 27th or so. Then there's the health care exchange bill, which the Senate still has not taken up because they balked at that for Obamacare reasons or whatever reasons. It's still also not clear. How high up is this going? I mean, is Dean Skelos on board with the idea that the governor, you know, that there would have to be some kind of reform action? I can't imagine that's the case.
I don't know what Dean Skelos is personally thinking about this. I just know that many of his, you know, Republican colleagues, including him, pledged to adopt an independent process during the 2010 campaign and have not done so. You know, 184 legislators either adopted the Koch pledge, signaled to Citizens Union that it supported an impartial process, or co-sponsored legislation. I think that, you know, during this LAT4 hearing over the series of LAT4 hearings over the summer, Citizens Union and others have been calling upon the legislature to return in special session. And I do know that, you know, there is some discussion about what is going to be the end game on this line drawing, because the governor has made very clear that he's going to veto the lines, and that if it gets thrown into the courts, the Senate Republicans are at a severe disadvantage.
Are you also hearing that the governor might be amenable to the idea that the Times is floating and others are floating, that he create a parallel entity that puts out its own maps that could be an alternative to LAT4 and or could supersede LAT4 if in fact that entity doesn't put out its lines?
Well, if the governor were to go that option, and I'm not sure what his thinking on that is presently, I mean, he couldn't simply have those lines adopted because the state constitution gives the legislature the final authority for adopting these lines with the governor approving or vetoing.
Right.
So his commission would be simply something that the courts could rely upon as an alternative way to draw the maps. I know that the governor to date has not proposed that publicly. We have not supported that publicly simply because we believe it lets the legislature off the hook. We want to keep the pressure and the focus on the need for a special session and for them to come back and create an impartial, independent process for drawing these lines. Because if a governor-appointed commission does this, it's going to be seen as a Democratic governor's plan.
Yeah, sure.
And I don't think that that is something that the Senate Republicans would like to see happen. I think the Senate Republicans, regardless, would want to be part of a process, whether it's under the current Lat 4 or this independent process that we've been advocating for.
There's this idea that if the governor does create an independent commission, and you know, he's been on vacation, we haven't had a chance to ask him, and I'm sure that we will, but the idea that this commission would put out its own plan and then somehow shame the legislature into acting doesn't seem to me to be something that actually is going to work. The legislature, as a collective entity, isn't big on shame.
No, it's not. And I don't think that the legislature would be cowed by having a Democratic governor present a plan of its own. And that's why I don't think it's a particularly plausible path to follow at this point, because it does let the legislature off the hook. The legislature wants to be part of this process. And I think what the governor is, has made clear is that he's going to veto these lines and pony up to the table. Let's talk about how we can create a new process together where all the parties have a stake in the outcome that is fair and independent and impartial. And
you also have the two sort of moving targets. A, the gerrymandering lawsuit, and we're not even sure what's going to happen there. And now you've got this weird situation where members of Lat 4, the Senate Republicans, are suing, and on the other side, Martin DeLon, who's a Democrat and is on that committee, has filed, a brief asking for it to be rejected along with the good government groups. It's all very confusing, but they're basically fighting against themselves. It's crazy. So that's the one